use a little hope right now? Of course not. You could use a lot of hope right now. Let's talk about it with Paul Miller on Steve Brown, etc.
He's an old white guy, an author, broadcaster, and seminary professor who's sick of religion. And he's brought friends. Please welcome Steve Brown, etc.
Hey, we're so glad you're here. I started to say, and waste your time with us, but this is never a waste.
Let's just see how it goes.
This is the most important hour of your week, and it is important that you be here each time we do this, or your friends will say, you missed it? By the way, I'm Steve, the aforementioned old white guy, and Matthew Porter, our executive producer, is with us. And I think he's going through football withdrawal when his youngest son dropped a chicken nugget. Matthew threw his napkin and called it intentional grounding.
Call him like I see him.
Before he jumped on the fumble.
That's true.
And our producer Jinx is in the little glass booth. When Jinx was young, snap, crackle, pop was what he heard in his cereal bowl. Now it's what he hears when he gets out of the bed in the morning.
Absolutely true. This morning it was crackle, crackle, crunch, crunch.
Our video director and genius and one-man IT department, John Myers, is in his tech bunker. And John reminds me to remind you, before calling your IT guy, why not try rebooting, okay? and George Bingham is the president of Key Life, Dr. George Bingham. He says if it's true that St. Patrick chased all the snakes out of Ireland, then it's a shame. He never visited Washington, D.C. And Kathy White is the soft feminine side of the program. I don't know about the luck of the Irish, but we're lucky to have her. Hey, we got a great guest today. He's a friend of mine, Paul Miller, and he's the executive director of See Jesus, a global discipling mission that mentors through seminars, cohorts, and interactive Bible studies. He's the best-selling author of A Praying Life, and I have a friend, and I agree with him, that was the best book on prayer he said he had ever read. And the J-Curve in his latest book, which I hold in my nicotine-stained fingers, is called The Praying Church, Becoming a People of Hope in a Discouraging World. Paul, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Steve. I'm looking forward to being with you today.
It's going to be a great time. Now, it sounds, frankly, boring. When we have the prayer meetings, and I was a kid, and those were the days we had them, I just died. I thought, if I don't get out of here, I'm going to die. And that attitude has kind of stuck with me, with a little bit of change. And that change is that sometimes Jesus shows. And when he shows, it's a whole new world. Boy, do we live in a time of discouragement, a dark time, when it's very easy if you're a Christian. I was reading an article this morning that said we've lost this battle. It's over. Forget about anything new happening. If you are a Christian, you're just going to have to accept you're a minority, that you're probably wrong, and you're ugly, and your mother dresses you funny. But this book will change that for you. It'll change it because it'll draw you to others, and Jesus promised to be where you guys are hanging out. How did this start? Were you bored with prayer too?
Yeah, I mean, I would actually say it's probably the biggest problem that people experience in prayer is just boredom, or boredom Christians, or people praying boring. You know what I mean? Which is kind of where it comes
Yeah.
from.
You know, you have a chapter in the book on start it slow and, don't try to do everything overnight. I just can't tell you the number of people that say to me when they get to the point they can trust me, listen, I've tried this season of prayer thing, and I've prayed the Lord's Prayer 4 times, everybody I knew twice, and I've only gone 10 minutes, and I don't know what to do. And then they come back the next day and try it again. By the third day, that's it. They're not going to do it anymore. So
Right.
I have said to them, limit it to 5 minutes or you'll get the hives. And pray the Lord's Prayer, read a verse of Scripture, and pray for me. And when you have to increase it, then increase it. And I'm being partly facetious, but partly serious. I've heard from them, many of them, who've said that changed my life.
Yeah.
And now I'm spending time that is the most important time of my life. But it's more important when you do it together. Talk to us about that.
Well, without reciting the whole book, let me just start with Pentecost. But ever since Pentecost, prayer has been, and particularly some form of corporate prayer, has been one of the principal characteristics of the Church of Jesus Christ. And it died out starting about 50 years ago. Partly it was well done, partly wasn't much faith in it. And I mean, it's striking that Christians in that 50 years have lost cultural power. And it just, there was a Barna poll that came out just before the pandemic. It was actually a research paper on prayer that they do like every 5 years on American spiritual habits. And praying was the number one habit. 70% of Americans have some form of prayer. Now that's every American, but the vast majority of that are believers of some stripe. But of those 70%, only 4% of them prayed with someone else.
Oh, man.
So it is just striking how much corporate prayer has died, and to see the church weakening during that time, and just being able to connect the dots.
And you would correlate that weakening thing of corporate prayer with the discouragement and the darkness that we're in now.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of what Jesus does. That he kind of lets you on your own, as Paul says in Romans 1, and I mean, I think the pandemic was the icing on the cake and kind of an accelerator. And I do think there is a bit of a turning of the tide, not just with what's going on in Asbury, but we're seeing in our work a lot more interest in prayer because God's weakened us. So a quick commercial on the J curve, which you mentioned briefly.
Yeah.
So what we've been so missed in our prayer and the way we think about prayer is what I call the J curve, but it's not, it's like the letter J, the normal Christian life goes down into dying and up into rising. And I know you're familiar with that, Steve. You actually, when we did the interview on that a couple of years ago, you had some negative comments on the J curve.
That doesn't sound like
Well,
Steve.
I repent. I've changed my mind.
Mostly because he can't remember what he said.
Yeah.
I think the pandemic has also had a positive side, at least in my life. I'm a man of prayer, and I kid about it, and it sounds so pious to say that, but I couldn't survive. I mean, I'm up at 4 a.m, and that's Jesus and coffee. or coffee and Jesus, I should say.
Yeah.
And it gets me up. But during the pandemic, Paul, I was lonely. I was lonely for God's people.
Yeah.
And, you know, I could watch worship on the internet, but it irritated me. It wasn't worship. I wasn't with his people. And
Yeah.
I remember the first worship service we went back to, the feeling I was home, and I didn't realize how much home it was. Maybe that's a positive side of the pandemic.
Oh, well, I think the whole idea, I mean, I think the whole idea of dying with Christ is that God uses things like it's a form of dying that weakens us, that we begin to see what's really important. It is in the dying that we learn how to pray. I learned how to pray, and my father, who was the one who taught me how to pray corporately, it was as he went through dying, and by that I mean the broad spectrum of dying to self. It was all like you can't learn how to pray separate from dying to self.
Oh.
So when pandemics come in from the outside, that acts that acts like a dying accelerator.
Oh, so good. Well, it's not such good news, but eventually it becomes really good news. You got to read this book, A Praying Church, Becoming a People of Hope in a Discouraged World. It'll make you feel a lot better. Hey, thanks for being with us. We're so glad you're here, and you always have a place at our table. We're talking with Paul Miller, and his latest book is titled A Praying Church, Becoming a People of Hope in a Discouraging World. I heard somebody on a broad news broadcast that was Christian say, if you want to change our culture, get involved in your church. It's that simple. And make sure that it's a solid church. Matthew?
Paul, before the break, you had mentioned a Barna poll, and some people, get depressed every time they read the news, and that's true. But I don't ever get depressed the same way I do when I read a new Barna poll, because you're like,
That's so true.
But when the news is bad, there is a time where you're like, it's time for someone, the right person, to bring a loving but hard word to the body to address what is going on and causing this bad news. And in a broad sense, that's what the book is, isn't it? There's a bit of a critique of the way we kind of are thinking about church. I wonder if you could just explain that a little bit.
Right. Yes. And the way people think about prayer, when they hear a book on prayer, they think, like they're a camel walking up through the desert and someone just threw another brick in there, or, in their backpack or whatever, and the loving inside critique I have of the way we think of the church really comes out of Luke and Acts and also the book of Ephesians. And in the book of Ephesians, which is really Paul's opus on the church, it's probably Paul's opus too. I mean, it pulls together every strand of his theology. And the book of Ephesians, as you look at the church, the most important thing is the Spirit of Jesus. The way you access the Spirit of Jesus is prayer. And therefore, that empowers the saints. So those three things are critical are the load bearing things in the church. Like they carry the weight: the Spirit of Jesus, prayer, and the saints. So, the entire first chapter is a prayer in Ephesians, and most people don't even know that. But if you actually read it, it's, oh wow, Paul's praying this whole time. So he's kind of doing church as he's doing, he's not preaching a sermon. So what's load bearing in the modern church? The sermon, Sunday morning, and the pastor. And none of those things were meant to be load bearing in the church, but they are functionally load bearing. And I'm not critical of any of them. I mean, they're all wonderful, but they shouldn't operate at the center. And that really came through, in the pandemic. Even I was really struck by how discouraging that was for pastors, but because. And I want to say this right, because here's this great dying that God has brought us into. That is where he does his best work, in that dying.
Mm.
And prayer is not, I mean, that's the principal move, not just in the church, but in all our dying. And you'll see it all through Ephesians. The way I describe it, and it's also in Luke and Acts, I call it the powertrain of the church. The powertrain of the church is prayer to the Father for the gift of the Spirit, who makes Jesus present, and out of that comes power. So it's 4 words, and it's very Trinitarian. So it's prayer, Spirit, Jesus, power. And so we've neglected the powertrain. I mean, that's how things get going in the church, is slowing the whole organization down, slowing the pastor's life down, and setting aside time to begin to wait on God in prayer.
You know, somebody one time visited Spurgeon's church in London, and was being shown around, and Spurgeon said, "Would you like to see the furnished room?" Mm-hmm. And this guest said, "Yes, I would. I'd be interested." So he took him to a room where the people were praying for the church and for the people and for revival in Spurgeon's ministry. And you're talking about the power. Reminded me of Spurgeon's referring to his prayer room as the furnace room of the church.
Yes.
Paul, maybe go into a little bit more specific along that line. You kind of contrast what we, modern church might be more kind of focused on, the preaching. And
which is not bad, obviously.
Yeah, and you kind of compare and contrast how those work together, preaching and praying. Can you talk a little more about that?
Well, they have a lovely cadence to them, because even just thinking of it from the leadership, but just my own life. So I am in public ministry. I need in my heart, no matter how hard you try to be humble in public ministry where you're speaking, you are still the center. Even if you're focused on Christ as you're doing it, people are physically looking at you. And there's instantaneous results in terms of people's heart being encouraged. Prayer is the exact opposite, is that no one's looking at me. It's the slow work of self. I have to, that prayer itself is a kind of dying. And that's why I say in Acts 6, where we hear the first job description of the leaders of the church, is they appoint deacons because they need to be faithful to a ministry of the word and preaching and a ministry of prayer. And they are kissing cousins. You need the rising of preaching needs to be matched by the dying of prayer.
I remember a professor at Gordon Conwell Seminary who was speaking at our church, and I wish I could remember his name, but I can't. I'm old, and that happens a lot. But I was thinking about him saying to our congregation, "Will you pray for me?" And it was more than just a passing comment. It was a plea. And he said, "I have noticed significantly in my ministry, as the older people who have prayed for me all the time of my ministry are dying off, the power is leaving what I'm doing." So he said, I really want you to pray for me. Not a bad comment, and one that agrees with what you said. We're talking about prayer, but it's not what you think, nor is this book what you think. It's titled A Praying Church, Becoming a People of Hope in a Discouraging World. And this would be an ideal book to study in your church. If you're a pastor, get it and then make it mandatory reading for the small groups in your church. And you don't do that just to show them that you are an intellectual, but to get some power in your church when it's dead. Guys, like Jesus, we're coming back. So glad you're here. We're hanging out with Paul Miller. You can check out more from Paul at cjesus, cjesus.net. Listen, I'm doing the best I can. You can follow him on Twitter, _Paul E. Miller.
Paul, during the break, you were talking about, kind of where this whole thing came from, and especially referred to a story about your dad. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I was 15 years old. So we lived in Philly. I grew up in California, and my dad had just finished his PhD in American literature. He was a professor at Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia. And he decided to visit Europe for a couple of weeks with mom and an elder in his church, and went to L'Abri and just wanted to see what was going on because he had students coming from there. And he encountered something at L'Abri that he had never seen before or experienced. And that was at the heart of L'Abri was the prayer meeting. They were a praying community. And then he went to a ministry in Holland, saw the same thing, and then went in London and saw the same thing. And I still remember him walking in the front doors, the first thing on his mind, like he had seen something he'd never encountered before. And it's interesting, Europe, even at that point, was post-Christian. So that was 1968. For 2 years, I saw Dad begin to devote himself to prayer, and nothing much happened. In fact, what happened is things got worse, even towards the end of that. And it's actually one of the here, just a commercial, I'll interrupt this story. One of the principal things that happen when you pray is fire. And Jesus predicts it. John the Baptist predicts it. It is just, in other words, is that there's a destructive, the killing function of the Spirit has to create a landing zone for Jesus. It's the simplest way to say it. And Dad had so 2 years later, discouraged, and decided to take a sabbatical in Spain. And later, towards the end of that or earlier that year, Dad read, I'm going to go theological, Geerhardus Voss's book on the Spirit. It doesn't mention the Spirit. It has the world's worst title. I can't remember the title of it. Pauline Eschatology. Like, they sat down with the marketing people and think, how can we kill this book? And anyway, and it shook Dad to the core. And the easiest way I can explain it is you've got this vision in Ezekiel of the Spirit coming, of water coming out of the temple, this incredible river of grace. And then you've got this vision of Revelation of that same river and grace, but we're in between. We're sort of eking out an existence. That was sort of Dad's practical theology. And when he realized we now live in the age of the Spirit, and the primary conduit to the work of the Spirit is prayer. That's why prayer is so important for the church. That also explains something in Paul's gift list that is really odd. There's no mention of the gift of praying. And if you heard my wife and I pray together, you would say, Paul, she prays better than you. And I would say, yes, there's no question. She prays better. I'm all organized and logical, and she prays from the heart. It's just lyrical.
I loved your description of your morning prayer with her. When she's interrupting you and telling you to do stuff, that's a sort of prayer too. Anyway, go ahead.
Right. And it just, and this blew Dad out of the water. He discovered the Holy Spirit, and he's still reformed, but it opened up his life to wonder. He began to expect more. And I remember sitting in this little country church where Dad was part-time pastor in the fall of 1970. We'd come home from this and Dad was just glowing with Jesus. And I wasn't that good of a Christian, but I remember thinking, you can't be that excited about Jesus and God not do something.
Yeah.
And I saw God do for the next 20, 25 years of Dad's life beyond all that you could ask or imagine.
For those of you who aren't familiar with Paul's father, his name was Jack, or that was what everybody called him, Jack Miller. And he was the founder of World Harvest, one of the forefathers of the modern-day grace movement. He affected my life deeply, and deeply the people with whom I'm associated. Literally changed the world. Missionaries all over the world.
Amen.
People have read his seminar and been involved in it and found they used to say, cheer up. You're a lot worse than you think you are. And cheer up, God's grace is a lot bigger than you think it is. And Paul, you're a mirror of him, and God's using you in the same way. How about that, sports fans? By the way, get this book. It's called A Praying Church, Becoming a People of Hope in a Discouraging World. So if you're down, you're discouraged, and you need hope, this book will point you in the way of the light and the fire and the water. We're so glad you're with us. By the way, we just released an updated Android version of our Key Life app. The iPhone version, Matthew says, but he's wrong a lot. He says the iPhone version isn't updated because it's already perfect. And then he adds, just like all Apple products.
They're still not going to give you a free phone.
No.
That's right. Never. But anyway, try it out for yourself. Go to keylife.org/app.
Paul, I know we want to follow up a little more about the actual content of the book, but I wanted to ask you one quick little question. In the very, very first segment, you made reference to what has transpired at Asbury, and which I think everybody has obviously been paying a huge amount of attention to. But you also talk about the story about what happened at Williams College, and that was totally new to me. So could you just share a little bit about that before we get back into the book?
Let me give you, I'll try not to make this answer too long, but when Solomon, let me go back 3,000 years.
Oh, okay.
When Solomon dedicated the temple, he dedicated it as a house of prayer. And he didn't preach a sermon on prayer, he prayed. It's really striking, and it's a prayer about prayer. It's really striking, and that DNA that the most important thing that happens in church on Sunday is prayer. That was one of the dominant features of the church, and of course that waxed and waned over the years. But there was a quiet groundswell in the 1700s with prayer, beginning with the Moravians with Count Zinzendorf, starting 100-year prayer meeting. I think it was in 1727. They were fighting so much that Zinzendorf decided to have an all night of prayer, and it was so remarkable the change in the community. They decided to keep it going.
100 years?
Wow.
What? For 100 years.
That's a bit much.
And all kinds of things started happening. And all kinds of things. And so maybe 20 years later, Edwards wrote that call to united prayer. So that idea began to permeate in the church. So in the early 1800s, 5 Williams College students, so this is in Massachusetts, gathered together out in a field to pray for world evangelization. And they got caught in a thunderstorm, and they all dove into a haystack and prayed under the haystack. So it was called the Haystack Prayer Meeting. And all of them became leaders in the world missions movement.
Oh, man.
And for that next 100 years, from like 1807 to 100 years later, the church, confessing Christians, went from 10% of the world's population to 30%. I mean, it was just unbelievable what happened.
Oh, man.
Wow.
Africa was penetrated. Latin America in new ways, China, all the missions were birthed, the early missions. I mean, it was incredible what happened.
Oh, man. Good story.
Wow. I think they.
So, Paul, I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to. The second chapter, I believe, is called Saints in Motion. I wonder if you could just kind of dive a little bit deeper into fleshing out what this looks like when it's put into action, and what's the content of that chapter.
Well, in the chapter on Saints in Motion, which I borrow from football, even though I don't watch football, it is that and what I do is I just go through a typical weekend, and I took 3 people, and one of them I'll just mention Jill, all just different stories I was hearing. And Jill's story was a remarkable story of someone that she had befriended, because we have a daughter with disabilities, so we're often reaching out in the community of disabilities. And Jill tried to get work for this kid, and the aunt was saying, maybe she could come to our church's disability program. And but just context, Jill had been loving this family and their daughter, not Christians, for probably about 10 years. I think she put in 200 hours. And she had never told anybody. And I told 2 other stories, all that I just heard of anecdotally. And that's the ministry of the church. The church programs are a tiny subset of what the saints are doing out there. And and the saints are, every church has probably, well, I know my wife, if I cataloged them, I think I could come up with 60 ministries she's involved with. And a couple she's paid for. And I bet you even the weakest Christian, I could come up with 2 or 3 ministries that they're doing. Like maybe the ministry is loving and bearing with Uncle Eddie when he talks all about himself at Thanksgiving dinner. That's a ministry, you know what I mean?
To the rest of the family.
You know what I mean? And the church is so defined and around our official programs. When you understand the incredible the potential in the Church of Jesus Christ, all of that needs to be fueled by prayer, because these are saints in motion. I mean, the church has an army that can be unleashed, but it needs spiritual power to do spiritual work. And I don't mean small s spiritual, as in, I mean, Oprah is spiritual, you know, if you think of small s. I'm talking the Holy Spirit. They need the Spirit of, they need Christ poured into them on Sunday so they can just leak out for the rest of the week.
And that happens with prayer.
Yeah.
We have a number of pastors who are watching or listening to this, and you have about 45 seconds. What would you say to them?
You don't need to be the center. God never designed you to be the center. The Spirit of Jesus is the center of the church. Slow down. Tithe your time to prayer. Get your staff praying. Get your elders praying. Slow down the cadence. Stop worrying about how good the Sunday morning looks. And give space for Jesus to come in.
Oh, man, that dog will hunt, and so will this book. Obviously, in an hour, we can't cover something that is this profound and so deep, so you got to get it. It's called The Praying Church, Becoming a People of Hope in a Discouraged World. This is the kind of book that'll change everything. Get it. And Paul, thanks for being with us. I know how busy you are, and when you take your time with us, it's well spent because you're teaching such good truth. And we rise up and call you blessed.
Thank you, Steve.
Hey.
Thank you all.
Guys, we're going to come back. I know some of you would rather we didn't, but we don't care. Or I don't. I'm old, and the good thing about being old is not caring. So, whether you want us to or not, we're coming back. When we do, we'll tell you who we're going to do it unto next week. Meanwhile, don't go anywhere. Man, what a good hour. Every time I spend time with Paul Miller, I feel like the smell of Jesus is in the room. A lot of you guys don't know, but Paul and his sister both lost adult children within a short period in their lives, and both have gone through some dark stuff. And the kind of stuff that causes people to get angry and bitter and to run. To have nothing more to do with God, and in both their cases, it was just the opposite. They became inflamed with the Spirit, and if you listen to this program or watched it on YouTube, you heard the reason for that. They don't just talk about prayer; they really pray, and it's not prayer like what you think. Very boring and old and liturgical, and you just get it through because you're supposed to do it. They really walk, and Paul is an example of that, of somebody who walks with Jesus. And it's catching, and that's the point of this book we've been talking about. It's catching to others, and when you pray together with somebody, and you can only do that over a period of time as it develops a sense of trust. The kind of people you can say things to, you just can't say to everybody, but you say them to God together, and things begin to happen in the church. And I personally believe, and so does Paul, that we're sitting on a time of awakening. And if it comes, and I think maybe it is, given Asbury and the Jesus Revolution and other things, that comes out of the people of God on their knees. And this book is a good book to give you a guide to do that. Catherine, who's going to be on next week?
You know those Ortland people that are your friends?
Yeah.
You know, Ray, those people had a lot of kids because, I mean, we've had Ray Ortland on and we've had Dane Ortland on.
Yeah.
Now we're going to have Gavin Ortland on, and he's written a great book, Humility and How I Attained It. No, I'm just kidding. It's Humility, the Joy of Self-Forgetfulness. So that should be a great time together.
And listen, it'll be an amazing program because, you know, it's hard to write a book on humility. And
we're waiting for yours.
It's the next one.
Okay.
And,
It'll be very short.
You can't put your name on it.
I get no respect around here. Guys, it's been fun. Thank you for being with us. And we'll see you next week, same time, same place. And between now and then, don't do anything we wouldn't. And that gives you a wide, wide berth.
You wanted to do the handshake, didn't you? You really wanted to. I can see it.
I forgot.
When I saw this book come, Humility, in these big letters, and I thought, and how I attained it, but and then, and I knew it wasn't going to say that, but the joy of self-forgetfulness.